We are continuing on with Unit 2. We're talking about the interactions among branches of government. Today we're talking about Topic 2.2. So Unit 2, Topic 2, which is the structures, powers, and functions of Congress. So we're talking about the different structures, powers, and functions of Congress, specifically powers given to the House and the Senate. So the learning objective for this topic is that students will be able to explain how the structure, powers, and functions of both houses of Congress affect the policymaking process. So we're talking about the powers of the House and the Senate and how those affect their ability to make policy. Okay, so essential knowledge number one. By design, the different structures, powers, and functions of the Senate and the House of Representatives affect the policymaking process, right? So we have two different chambers. The law, in order for a law to become a bill, it has to pass through both chambers. The structure of the Senate, right? There's 100 members, so debate is more formal. There's less rules or more informal. There's fewer rules in the Senate because there's fewer members, right? So we have these things like filibusters, and we have ways that minority members from the minority party can prevent a bill from being passed in the Senate, filibuster, right? Whereas the House is much more formalized. It's much more stricter when it comes to its rules, right? There's a rules committee designed to put limitation on debate. You can't have 435 members debating for hours and hours and hours, right? So there's much stricter time limits. There's much stricter rules on debate in the House than there is in the Senate. The powers given to the House, right? There's really one main power given to the House, and that is the power, well, there's two really. The power to all revenue bills, all appropriation bills, so bills that deal with taxation and spending must start in the House, right? All revenue and appropriation spending bills will start in the House of Representatives. And then the House also, in the impeachment process, is responsible for impeaching a government official, right? So they bring the charges against an official with a majority vote in the House. The Senate has a few more powers, right? The Senate is responsible for confirming all presidential appointments. So all presidential appointments have to be confirmed by a majority vote in the Senate. The Senate would then try the impeached official and can remove an impeached official with a 2/3 vote in the Senate, right? The Senate's also responsible for confirming presidential treaties, right? That all treaties that are entered in by the president must be confirmed with a 2/3 vote in the Senate. So the Senate has a few more powers given to it by the Constitution, right? Which those can then greatly affect the policymaking process. The essential knowledge number two is that both chambers rely on committees to conduct hearings and debate bills under consideration. Different constitutional responsibilities of the House and the Senate affect the policymaking process. So here we're really talking about the Rules Committee, the House Rules Committee, right? We know that the House and the Senate is divided up into committees. There's about 19, 20 standing committees in the House and the Senate. And this is where bills are first referred to when they are entering the legislative process, right? However, there's different ways that the bill can be affected in the House or the Senate, right? The House, we have a Rules Committee, so once the bill goes through the committee, and it basically, before it's going to go to the full House, it's going to go to the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee is going to put rules for debate, they're going to put time limits, and they're going to schedule a vote for the bill, right? So there are no filibusters in the House of Representatives. Where there's the Senate, there are fewer rules. There is no Rules Committee. And this does allow for filibuster. And an individual senator, usually from the minority party, can prevent a bill from passing by issuing a filibuster, right? And we know that filibusters can be stopped by cloture, 60 votes. So oftentimes, most rules or laws that are introduced in the Senate need a 60-member vote in order to pass. right? 60 members. You're like, wait, I thought it only needed a majority. You're right, it does only need a majority. But remember that minority senators can filibuster a bill, and a filibuster can only be prevented by 60 members. So oftentimes you need 60 members to prevent a filibuster, and if you don't have 60 members, a bill will be filibustered and killed. Chamber-specific procedures. So the third essential knowledge that you should know is that chamber-specific procedures, rules, and roles that impact the policymaking process include the number of chamber and debate rules that set the bar high for building majority support, right? So the chamber debate rules, specifically talking about filibuster and the need for 60 members to invoke cloture, which would end a filibuster, right? The roles of the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, party leadership, and committee leadership in both chambers, right? So that we know that the Speaker of the House oversees the House of Representatives. He basically is responsible for assigning bills to committees. He appoints committee membership in the House of Representatives, and he oversees the whole House of Representatives, right? The President of the Senate is generally the leader of the majority party, right? Remember that constitutionally, the head of the Senate is the Vice President. However, the Vice President's role, his only role, is to break a tie in the Senate. So much of the day-to-day legislative procedures in the Senate often falls on the President pro tempore or the President of the Senate, same thing. Party leadership, right? We know that party leadership is important in both chambers. A divided government versus a unified government. A divided Congress where both houses are controlled by the same party, obviously is going to ease and make the legislative process a little bit easier for that party, versus a divided legislature where one party controls the House like we have now. The House is controlled by the Democrats, and the Senate is controlled by the Republicans. So we have a divided legislature, and that often can impact the policymaking process, right? We look for more compromise, right? We look for more bipartisan legislature, or we end up with gridlock. And an inability to accomplish anything is what gridlock is. And the committee leadership, right? We know that the committees in both chambers are controlled by the majority party. So whoever has the majority party in the House and the Senate often controls the committees in that respective chamber. So there's usually a majority of the majority party members on a committee. And obviously they can impact and influence the legislative process within their own committee. The filibuster and cloture, we talked about that, right? We know that filibuster is only in the Senate because the Senate does not have rules on debate, so therefore a individual senator from the minority party can often debate a bill until it dies, right? But we can stop, a filibuster can be stopped by cloture. But remember, cloture needs 3/5, 60 senators in order to stop that filibuster. So a lot of the procedures, voting on bills, voting on presidential confirmations often require 60 votes informally, right? We know that it only requires 50 majority vote to pass, but often requires 60 votes in order to prevent a filibuster. Holds and unanimous consent in the Senate, right? That these holds can be put on bills, particularly in the committees, right? And that unanimous consent is the way to which a hold or filing a discharge petition. So these bills are often held up in committees, which basically prevents them from moving out of the committee, right? Usually there's a saying that committees are the places where bills go to die. And that is often very true because of the holds and the delays that are often put on these bills to ensure that a bill doesn't get out of the committee. The role of the Rules Committee, the Committee of the Whole, and just discharge petitions in the House. So the Rules Committee is really important, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier, but it is basically responsible. It's the committee responsible for putting specific rules on debate in the House. So before a bill goes to the full House, right, we know that it goes to the subcommittee, the committee. If it passes out of both of those, then it goes to the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee puts specific rules on debate for that bill, schedules a time for that bill to be voted on, and that bill will be debated and voted on those specific days. So that often prevents filibuster and keeps the policymaking process moving in the House. The committee of the whole is generally when the whole committee or the whole Congress comes together to vote on things. This is usually done during the State of the Union address, right? And oftentimes is not as relevant because a lot of times Senate and the House operate independently. And discharge petitions, right? In order to prevent a hold in the House, a discharge petition could be filed. If a bill is hung up in the House, in the committee, a House member can file a discharge petition to force that bill out of the committee and get it to the floor for a vote. All right. Treaty ratification and confirmation role of the U.S. Senate. We kind of talked about these specific roles of the Senate earlier, but all presidential appointments, right, need to be approved by the Senate. Majority vote in the Senate, right? Could be 60 members, but majority will pass it unless it could be filibustered, right? There has been a nuclear option that's been installed. You don't really need to know that, but basically the nuclear option says that presidential appointments only need a majority vote and cannot be filibustered. And the treaty ratification, this one is important. That along with the Senate approving all presidential appointments with a majority vote, the president has the power to enter into treaties with foreign countries. But one of the checks and balances on the president's power to enter into treaties is that to keep him limited, right, to prevent his power, the Senate must confirm those treaties with a 2/3 vote. So the Senate controls or has to confirm or approve a presidential treaty with a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Congress must generate a budget that addresses both discretionary and mandatory spending. All right, so we're going to highlight discretionary and mandatory spending. And as entitlement costs grow, discretionary spending opportunities will decrease unless tax revenues increase or the budget deficit increases. Okay, so we're talking about discretionary versus mandatory spending, right? What's the difference? Mandatory spending is required by law, right? It's the money that is paid out by Congress and is required by law. Most of these come from entitlements, right? Entitlements are mandatory spending. It's money that must be paid to the people that qualify for them. And a big portion of the budget is controlled by mandatory spending, right? Discretionary spending is whatever's left over. After all the mandatory spending is spent, what is left over in the budget for the president with approval from Congress to spend on things like defense. Defense is often a discretionary item. What is left to spend on, whatever the goals of the president are, right? Building a wall or something like that, right? So that is discretionary spending. What's left over in the budget to spend at the president and Congress's discretion. So as these mandatory spending increases, right, it drives down the discretionary spending, the amount of discretionary spending that is available. So what has to happen? Well, either you have to cut, it says discretionary spending opportunities will decrease unless tax revenue increases or the budget deficit increases. So as this mandatory spending is going out, right, you either have to bring in more money, right? So if you bring in more money, increase tax revenue, that's going to create more money for discretionary spending. Or, right, the budget deficit increases. If you're spending money that you don't have, right, then the budget deficit, the amount of money that we are in debt, is going to continue to increase. Okay. And then lastly, pork barrel legislation and log rolling affect lawmaking in both chambers. So pork barrel, pork, right, bringing home the bacon. Pork is usually an amendment that's added to legislation, or it could be legislation designed to benefit a specific House district, right, or state. So as a representative of district, you are looking to pursue legislation that will benefit your constituents, the people you represent, right? And by doing so, you're going to bring job opportunities, you're going to bring funding, you're going to bring research, you're going to bring government resources to your district, to your people, right? Available to your people. So it's going to benefit your people. It's bringing home the bacon, it's bringing home the resources to your people. And then log rolling, right? Log rolling is essentially vote trading. So oftentimes, you know, in Congress, voting is based on partisanship. The Democrats tend to vote one way and Republicans tend to vote the other. It is a very partisanship-based voting structure in both the House and the Senate. However, on these nonpartisan bills, there can be this vote trading, right? That if it doesn't necessarily affect you, your party, or your district, that you might vote yes for this law, even though it has no effect on you, right? Hoping that, or knowing that in the future, that I will vote for your bill when you need a vote on your legislation. So if you have legislation that's going to benefit you, it might not have any effect on me or my district or my people or my party, then I might vote for you in the future. It's essentially vote trading. And that happens mostly on nonpartisan bills, mostly bills that aren't affected or have little effect on the party or the district or the state that person represents. And it's vote trading more or less for legislation in the future. So that's it. That's a big one. Wrapping up Unit 2. Topic 2, Structures, Powers, and Functions of Congress. Keep studying. If you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me. Thanks.